We're really pleased to have you here today for the 9th annual Johns Hopkins Symposium on Engineering and Healthcare. Today's theme this year is Human and AI, Redefining the Standard of Care in Medicine. So I hope that title speaks for itself, but in this new era that we find ourselves in, we think in this center that it's especially important for us to think about how the human, both the clinician and the patient, interact with technology, and particularly with AI, in medicine. So very briefly, if it comes up, I will introduce myself. If it doesn't come up, I'll just do it anyway. So I'm Alexis Battle. I'm a professor in biomedical engineering and computer science, and I am the director of the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare. Oh, very briefly. You already know what I look like. Great. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit before we get started about the Malone Center. So the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare is a really special center. It is housed in engineering, but with a face towards medicine, where our mission is really to catalyze and accelerate the development, the translation, and the deployment of new technologies that advance the effectiveness and efficiency of healthcare. So all of us in this center are really thinking about how can we improve healthcare? How can we use the techniques and methodology from engineering, from computer science, to really improve patient care and to improve healthcare? So it's a very translational, very cross-disciplinary, very interdisciplinary center. To tell you just a little bit more about it, we are sort of a medium-sized center. We have a core of 11 endowed chairs, 17 core faculty members, but a broader group of 46 affiliate members. That includes faculty from all across the university, from engineering to medicine to nursing to public health. In addition, we welcome postdoctoral members. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. And we, as I said, we span really broadly across the university. Over 25 different departments, centers, and institutes are represented among our faculty. If you'd like to learn more about the Malone Center, please go ahead and scan the QR code for more information. We think broadly about many different areas in engineering that can be applied in healthcare. I list some of the core ones here that I'll just discuss very briefly. So of course in this era we think about data and artificial intelligence, but areas including mobile health, medical imaging, systems modeling and optimization, robotics, devices, and specifically I think even today thinking about user-centered design, again bringing the human into the picture, thinking about how technology interacts with medicine with the humans involved in the system. And before we get started today, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the incredibly generous donation from Dr. John Malone, who donated $30 million to the School of Engineering to construct Malone Hall, and then in 2016, established the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare and endowed the Malone professors that I mentioned earlier. The Malone Center, with his input, is truly a visionary effort to bring together engineers and clinicians to think about these high-impact problems in healthcare settings. So I really want to give a tremendous thanks to Dr. Malone for his gift and his endowment and his support of our efforts. And his vision has really inspired a lot of the work that we do. So before we move on to talk about what we're going to go over today in the symposium, I mentioned that we do welcome postdoctoral fellows as members of the Malone Center. And in fact, we have a fellowship program for postdocs that we've had active, I think, now for 3 years, but I'm particularly excited about. And I mention it today because applications are currently open. So the Malone Postdoctoral Fellow Program is not only a named award, but it also comes with salary support from the center. It comes with travel stipend and mentoring by affiliated faculty across this interdisciplinary area, in addition to participation in all of our amazing center programs and resources. So if you are trainees or you know trainees who might be interested, please apply. There is a link, an interfolio application available now. If you're a faculty member and you think you might like to recruit a postdoc who would be a good member of this fellow, again, please look at the advertisement or get in touch with me if you'd like to learn more. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to our two symposium co-chairs just to introduce them briefly. Chien-Ming Huang is the John C. Malone, I think now Associate Professor of Computer Science, very recently. And in addition, Michael Oberst, an Assistant Professor of Computer Science, and they're really the ones to thank for leading the organization of this symposium today, and they'll walk us through the rest of the agenda.
So good morning, everyone. Very happy to see everyone here. My name is Chien-Ming Huang. Just want to say a very big welcome for today. We have a very exciting program for you. You'll see more of me later, but I'll pass it to Michael to walk you through our exciting program for the day.
Yes, hello and welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. My name is Michael. I'm one of the co-chairs organizing today, and I come with props, and these props are going to be important as we go through the agenda for today. So here we go. The official theme of the symposium today is human and AI, and you've heard a bit about that. The unofficial theme is building community and collaboration across the center. So we have a lot of events in the agenda today that are specifically geared towards that. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of those. So let's see here. The first prop that I brought with me is the agenda itself. So you should all have these either at your table or you can pick them up at the registration desk. And these walk you through the events of today. Two things I want to highlight in the morning. Of course, you are here at opening remarks, but we also have a pitch a problem session and a morning exhibition hall, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. And then in the afternoon, in addition to some of the sessions, which I'll sort of briefly allude to in a moment, we have the afternoon exhibition hall, which, like the morning exhibition hall, is a poster session, as well as roundtable discussions. So we have a bunch of excellent speakers lined up for today. So in the morning, speaking on AI for medical education, medical training and education, we have Shameema Sikder, who is the director of the Center for Excellence for Ophthalmic Surgical Education and Training at the Wilmer Eye Institute. Later on in the morning, we have lots of animations here. Peter Najjar speaking about AI for quality and safety. He is the Vice President of Clinical Innovation at the Johns Hopkins Health System, and he'll be talking about unlocking the promise of deployed AI for quality and safety. But I wanted to sort of bring to your attention in particular some of these morning activities that are focused on building collaboration across the center. So my second prop, you may have noticed these sheets of paper that are floating around, either at the registration desk or at your table. In fact, there are two separate pieces of paper. You'll notice they have different titles. One of them is titled Pitch a Problem. And so in the morning at 9:30, we have the Pitch a Problem session where different clinical experts from across the School of Medicine, School of Nursing, and the School of Public Health will do, as the title suggests, pitch a problem. And the goal is to sort of spark collaboration and community building around those problems, brainstorming potential solutions and hopefully sparking some opportunities for collaboration. We also have in the morning the exhibition hall. That's the poster session. You can find the poster session out through the hall to the right in the Great Hall, and we hope that will also be sort of an engaging activity this morning. Then in the afternoon, we have a session on AI for diagnostics led by Paul, Andrew, and Harris. In the interest of time, I won't sort of give you all their titles. You can find them in the program, and you will hear more about them later today. And then we also have a star-studded panel on AI for clinical documentation, led by Anirudh Sridharan, who's the Interim Chief Information Officer at Johns Hopkins Medicine, as well as a number of other individuals from the health system. And then finally, in the afternoon, we also have some collaboration building activities. So we have the poster session in the afternoon and roundtable discussions, where just like with the Pitch a Problem, you can find more information on the relevant pieces of agenda paper that you may have picked up at registration. So final bits of information for today, very important, perhaps the most important slide. So bathrooms are down the stairs from here. You can vote for your favorite posters in both exhibition halls. Coffee breaks, you can go out into Levering Hall, which is just through the door on that side. And please do fill out our post-symposium survey. And with that, I will introduce Swaroop, Vedula, who is the associate research professor, who is an associate research professor in the Malone Center, and he will kick off the intro to our first talk of the day. All right, thank you, Swear.
Thank you, Michael. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Shameema Sikder today. Shameema and I have been working for almost 12 years now. She is the L. Douglas Lee and Barbara Levinson Lee Professor of Ophthalmology in the Wilmer Eye Institute. She directs the Center of Excellence for Ophthalmic Surgical Education and Training. Our research has benefited tremendously from her expertise and insights as not only as a surgeon but also educator and training. But it is also a superb connection because of her engineering background. She's been awarded NIH R01 awards and Microsoft for Startups Award and the Maryland Innovation Institution, the MII Phase 1 award for translating some of the AI that she has been developing with us. Shameema, thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I think a lot of credit actually goes to Swaroop. So I'm the lucky one who gets to work with such really amazing individuals here at the Malone Center. So good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I'd like to thank the organizers for thinking about me and allowing me to participate in today's conference. It's a really exciting theme because as we think about how technology continues to evolve, we're pondering how humans are going to actually still remain in the mix. And so I think hopefully after chatting for a few minutes, you'll be reassured that there's still a place for us humans in healthcare. So I'm just advancing here, and maybe we can see that there. All right. So in the many hats that I wear, and everyone here wears a lot of hats, I participate in a fair amount of surgical training. And so whenever we think about training the next generation of surgeons, we're always wondering how we can do a better job. After all, one day I'm going to be their patient, and I want to make sure that they take good care of me. So I think when we think about artificial intelligence and how it's evolving, there's a thought, should artificial intelligence be this sort of surgical guide on the side, or is it really going to take over and be this wise sage on the stage? And so over the next few minutes, I'll share with you some of the thoughts that I have about how this field continues to evolve. While there are no conflicts of interest, some of the material that we're presenting is sort of under the umbrella of some intellectual property that has been filed by Hopkins. And of course, first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the people who are generous in funding some of the work that we're doing here. So without a doubt, no one individual can really accomplish that much, and I think that it is a true testament to all of us who are participating in interdisciplinary research. So I really want to start off by tipping my hats to the wonderful colleagues that I have here at the Malone Center at the Whiting School of Engineering as well. This is what makes things exciting. When you're a part of Hopkins, you get to tackle some interesting problems, but the key is you get some really smart people that you get to engage with. So thanks to all of you. So as we think about the evolution of how we get around, some people might remember this image on the far left. It's called a map, and it used to be printed on paper. And if you've ever had the pleasure of doing a family road trip, it sometimes involved a little bit of tense discussion about which exit you need to take, because otherwise you'll be ending up in a different city. But that's how we got around. And so either people were really good at directions, or they were really good at remembering which McDonald's they needed to take a left at before they reached their final destination. But that's how we got around. And to be honest, it worked. I mean, people managed to get from point A to point B, probably a little bit lost along the way, but in general, they got to their final destination. Well, clearly, things have changed, and now many of us use GPS so much that we can't even figure out how to get home without it. And that is a recognition of how we develop habits, and it's nice to have someone who's paying attention to traffic conditions and guiding us along different routes, and basically looking out for us and offering us that sort of guide on the side capacity. But we all know where this is heading. Eventually, many, if not all of us, are eventually going to be getting into one of these automated cars and be able to check email or take a nap or catch up on phone calls while someone else is doing the driving. And it doesn't have to be a human that you have procured for the day, but it's just some technology that's getting things done. And not everyone is ready to hop into one of these cars yet, but I think we all agree that the technology has arrived, and certainly it's being integrated within our normal day-to-day life. So how does this sort of relate to surgical training? And I think that there is a very analogous sort of evolution that's taking place. And for the purposes of our discussion, what we can recognize is that as things stand now, there is a natural human-human interaction in surgical training, in surgical skill development, in surgical execution. And much of that involves sort of quiet conversations between cases in the operating room, some rush discussions between cases on a busy surgery day, and if there's time and blood sugar capacity, a discussion at the end of the day. And as you can imagine, that this model that takes place day in, day out across the country and the world is really variable. It's really variable, and some people are getting a lot out of this experience, and others are just sort of making their way through the day. Eventually, perhaps that assistant on the side will be replaced with technology. Whether ChatGPT is going to be taking over for everything remains to be seen, but there's this idea that if you need to have engagement with someone, something that's going to offer you insight, maybe it's going to be a technology that's acceptable and accessible in your fingertips 24 hours a day. So whether you wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat wondering, maybe that one thing you did during surgery was not right, you may have a friend or a guide on the side to be able to help assure you what you did well, and more importantly, what you can do better. But the question really becomes, well, what's going to happen as technology continues to evolve? Is this idea of us being replaced, us as humans being replaced by robots, a reality? I'm not sure that we're necessarily going to have the Terminator in the operating room, although I will spare some commentary on personality types in the OR, but certainly we can recognize that there is an evolution taking place. And so the question is, what is sort of the realistic trajectory for this, and what are the practical pathways to be able to advance such an evolution? So first, I'll just take a moment just to acknowledge, am I sort of helping to ensure my own demise? I would respectfully argue no. I think that job security is still going to remain in place, but it's going to change. And I think that that's the reality of how AI is now integrating into our lives and our jobs, that we have to be able to adapt and be able to figure out how we can interface with that technology. So just to give a little bit of context, the world needs a lot of surgery. There's a lot of surgery already happening, and there is more surgery that needs to be done as we have aging populations. With age comes increasing disease. The average American in their lifetime will have 9 surgeries. And as you can imagine, that seems like a lot, but that's just an average. There are people who have many more. And as I joke that we slowly are becoming bionic people with having different parts of our bodies replaced, the need for surgery will only increase. And the practical consideration is that there are not, as it stands now, nor in the immediate future, enough surgeons available to do all that surgery. So what are some of the surgeries that we are going to focus on? Excuse me. So as a cataract surgeon, I have to put a pitch in for cataract surgery. So those of you who may already know, cataract surgery is the most commonly performed surgery within the world. And cataracts are actually the second most common cause for moderate and severe vision impairment. The first cause is actually uncorrected refractive error. So the power of glasses is indeed quite powerful. So without a doubt, if we think about a common surgery that needs to be done often and there's a huge need for it, we recognize that cataract surgery fits the bill quite nicely. In fact, while there are about 30 million cataract surgeries performed every year, there are so many more people who need cataract surgery. And though I like to think of myself as an efficient surgeon, I can tell you, even on my busiest OR days, if you multiply them 5 days a week, I will not personally be able to get rid of this backlog. So how can we then tackle this problem of unmet surgical need. I will argue that it's not by building more hospital beds, though that would be nice. It's not necessarily by training more surgeons, though that's certainly a good thing to have. But I think that one thing that is something for us to think about is how we can ensure surgical competence and really improve the quality of surgery that's performed and improve the efficiency of surgery as well. And that may end up being an effective, though not only, way to address this huge surgical backlog. So I just want to give a little bit of context about how plentiful surgeons are, and I'm going to give the example of an ophthalmologist because here I am and I want to talk about my other folks. And so when we look at the number of ophthalmologists per million people, on the left panel we can see that there are many countries that have a fair number of ophthalmologists. But then you can see on the right, there are a lot of cataracts that need to be tackled. These are not necessarily the number of cataract surgeries that are being performed, but the number of cataracts that are present in a given year. So now switching gears and looking over at the panel on the right, there are many, many countries for whom there are not enough ophthalmologists, fractions of what we're used to seeing here in the US. However, they still have a surgical burden that needs to be addressed. And so I would argue that we have to now maybe think a little bit outside the box about how we can solve this problem. And it may not be just training more surgeons. It may be training other humans, like technicians or nurses, to be able to do some components or all components of a surgical procedure. And I know that's a very controversial thought. But then as we think about technology and how technology can help augment this problem, you can see a very important use case for why it is important. Yes, technology is expensive, but it's expensive now, and as we see, especially with our iPhones and everything that we have access to, technology gets faster. In some ways it does get cheaper, and as we're able to mass produce it, it becomes easier to obtain. So if we really project to the future, what is the practical thought for AI surgical autonomy? Well, ideally, it would be systems that are capable of performing these surgical tasks with minimal human oversight. Of course, if we want to think about our favorite futuristic science fiction movie, sure, there can be robots that wheel in and do all sorts of things all by themselves. But for us to truly get to that stage of technology, I think is going to take some time. But from the ethical and sort of human consideration, I think unless we're talking about an astronaut in space by themselves, probably people still would like, if possible, to have a human involved in their surgical care. The practical consideration for having this autonomy is actually having robotics, computer vision techniques and methodologies that are with high accuracy and efficiency to be able to help create real-time decision-making tools. And ultimately, much of this work needs to be done not to sort of take over for the human, but at least first start by creating more of a superhuman. If we can help minimize error, increase precision, I think that's the practical consideration for how this technology will play out. Here on the right is an example of recent robotic system that was approved in Europe for surgical treatment for retinal disease. So what's driving all of this? Well, certainly I don't need to say to all of you here in the audience today that there is a tremendous improvement and evolution in how we're able to think in this artificial way and be able to be creating these outputs that are more realistic and along the lines of what humans are thinking. But these efforts, as important as they are still affected by the level of improvement that can happen on a mechanical sense as well, as far as sensor accuracy and actually being able to implement. Surgical data continues to increase. However, it really is still a drop in the ocean. If you consider the training models that are used for your favorite LLM, the surgical data sets, though we continue to grow our own internal data set, and it's among the largest that we know of, it's still a fraction for what's out there to be able to train other modalities. So this is obviously a challenge. I think there's going to be a role for generative AI in creating perhaps surgical training videos that will be allowing us to be able to test these models further. But as you know, hallucinations are very, very real, and being able to create surgical videos that are generated from AI have a lot of hurdles that they need to cross. But with time, we hope that we can use the ability to have real-time imaging, which is now more prevalent and with higher sort of resolution, and engage that within simulation to be able to help drive this movement towards autonomous surgery. So what are some of the benefits? Well, at the end of the day, when a patient interacts with a human surgeon, there is an interpersonal dynamic that I think is really critical. And we were chatting earlier that while there are many elements of the process of surgical care that would be nice to outsource to sort of get that bread and butter stuff out of the way and allow for a more meaningful and engaging human-human interaction, we have to recognize that the technology offers benefits, and what are the other benefits that we would like to have. So having this ability to engage in clinical and surgical care that is more consistent and has reduced variability is important. We know that there are clinical measures for patient outcomes. Specifically, for example, for cataract surgery, we're looking at complication rates, vision after surgery, need for any further surgery, and these are easily things that we can measure. But what happens inside the operating room is a far more murky picture. There are no standardized objective metrics for what is happening in the surgical field. And without understanding what's happening in real time in the OR, it makes it even harder for us to figure out how we're going to optimize what's actually happening there. With the implementation of semi-autonomous and autonomous surgery, there is this thought about being able to operate in more remote and underserved areas, as I highlighted in the figures before. And without question, humans get tired. And so if we are able to leverage this technology to allow humans to be able to sort of operate at their peak performance, that would only drive better outcomes. The idea of having data-driven decision support tools is something that sort of rolls off the tongue, and we all naturally think that there's a benefit to it. But I think we all recognize there is such a thing as data fatigue. How many of us wear Apple Watches and now at this point we're just tired of whatever buzz or ding is coming on our wrist? And sometimes we even feel something that's not even there because our body is so attuned to having something be signaled every so often. So whenever it comes to the delivery of data, I think it requires a very thoughtful consideration for how much data is being delivered. What is the value of that data? How much is that valuable data actually changing how decision-making is made? And I think while these are certainly potential benefits, they all require some very thoughtful consideration. So what are some of the challenges and risks that are involved with such an evolution? I think, as I mentioned briefly earlier, there's this ethical consideration, right? So if a robot is assisting surgery and there is a power surge or there's a software update that needs to take place in the middle of surgery, who is going to be responsible for those complications? You know, at the end of the day, the surgical training paradigm as it stands now relies on residents and fellows who are supervised in their surgery. And patients will often say, well, who's doing the surgery? Well, we say we're doing it together. And ultimately, that's because I, as the attending surgeon, am 100% responsible for whatever happens, regardless of whose hand happens to be in the eye at the moment, whether it's my own or my trainees. I am responsible. Well, what happens when technology starts coming into the operating room and literally having a hand on the field? Who is still responsible? Well, we could make the argument that the surgeon is an important part of this process. So we have here this pathway of how the FDA sort of is involved in the regulatory process. But you'll see in the data flow from collecting the data that was driven by the hypothesis for validating this technology, the algorithms get developed, the FDA approves, patients end up getting care, good care, we hope, and there's a benefit to society. But what is really critical, and I think doesn't get emphasized enough, especially to a clinical audience, are these two black arrows that are going backwards. How is the information that we're learning actually being implemented in an iterative way to be able to improve these approved devices? So we have to recognize that the clinician, even when technology is deployed, is still an important part of the process. And we know that certainly when bad things happen, everyone is very happy to report and try to offer an improvement for devices and technology that need further refinement. But as we think about these new workflows, the responsibilities will shift a little bit, and I think that it's important for us to recognize that everyone still has an important role. Ultimately, we ask a lot of our patients. They come in, they don't have the medical knowledge that we do. They know they have a problem, and they assume, for whatever reason, Google reviews or what their neighbor said or how they feel when they're talking to you, that you as a surgeon are someone they can trust. And that trust is really important. But when this patient comes into the operating room, they're having to trust a lot of people, the scrub tech who maybe knew that day, the machine that maybe didn't have the foot pedal charged properly overnight, the instrumentation that needed to be completely sterilized in order to minimize infection. So a lot of that trust is implicit. However, it's standardized within surgical care as it stands now. What will happen as technology is included in this process, some of it will just be assumed to be part and parcel of the whole process. But as some of these newer technologies, I think, have a little bit more prominence in the operating room, these robotic arms that have a surgeon at the console, or more exciting robotic arms that have a surgeon at the console half a world away, then I think the ethical considerations become a little bit more challenging. And certainly for patients, that is something that's going to have to be part of their informed consent process, understanding who is really involved in their surgery, and more importantly, who is ultimately responsible. We have to think about how data bias is going to have an impact. So many of these training data sets may be skewed towards one gender or another as far as the patient population. The surgeons who are using it may be in academic centers instead of community facilities. And so there will be a lot of sort of discussion that will need to happen about making sure that this process, which really is developing in order to allow for scalability of high quality surgical care, really reflects a diverse population that needs to be involved in that training ability. And we mentioned a little bit about the liability and responsibility. And then, without a doubt, as humans, I think we all are excited by new things. But if you look at that sort of bell curve of people who are eager to adopt and those who are late to adopt, some of those people who are late to adopt is because they don't want to deal with the new challenges that come with adopting new things. And without a doubt, whenever you implement new technologies, there's going to be a real need to be able to have a resilience to that, challenges that may ensue. So as we think about the evolution of autonomous surgery, of course, the end goal would be amazing to have a fully autonomous AI-driven surgeon. And there are certainly a lot of startups and med tech companies that are looking into elements of this. I was reading about a company based out of California who is looking at basically creating this autonomous surgery for a type of prostate surgery. That sounds really exciting, but then if you start thinking about it, well, how many robots is a hospital supposed to have? If you start developing surgery specific, you may end up having more storage for medical devices than room for patients at the rate that we're going. And these devices certainly aren't small. So certainly there will be a need for being able to create technology that is widely applicable and has a broad base to be able to improve surgical care. But before we get to fully autonomous, I think semi-autonomous is a good goal to have, and that really is a more AI-guided surgeon. And this may be technology as simple as having a probe that allows minimization of a tremor. That's a gentle assistance. Devices that will allow, for example, for specific surgical tasks to be completed with higher efficiency and precision, like cannulation of blood vessels. Having the technology on board to be able to execute that skill higher will have a direct patient benefit. But ultimately, we have to rely on the independent human surgeon. This is the core of being able to figure out what we need to understand in order to have technology that will then help create superhumans and then potentially alternate humans. So I think it's important to take a moment to think about how surgeons think. And we could make a joke quite well of themselves is probably one answer, but we certainly want to consider how this thought process sort of engages. So I love this slide that comes out of the University of Toronto in the Regulatory Effective Dynamics Lab. And basically, the idea is that for all of us, in a situation, in any given moment, we are in the present where the red circle is. And this allows for us to think about sort of different components of what's happening in real time. But for us to fully understand where we are, we have to sort of think in two additional dimensions. And I think this is very true of surgical educators, those of us who are watching someone else do surgery, because we're very hyper attuned to what's happening, because we very much need to figure out what have we seen in the past? What do we remember? What looks similar like the surgical field? What issues did we have that were similar to the ones we're experiencing today? And then I think that what is particularly challenging and comes with experience is being able to push forward and think about this imagined future. So as a surgical trainee, I will admit, sometimes I was with really expert surgeons and they would catch me doing something and ask me to redirect. And to me, it felt like they could see into the future. And that's a really magical skill to have, especially if you can prevent someone from getting into trouble. So without a doubt, we have to take in so many different variables in our clinical decision making. And as we think about moving on to AI sort of driven technologies, I think that this slide offers a very serious thought about how can we integrate these different elements of information into real-time decision making. So how do we define good surgery? Well, the easy thing is to say, how did the patient do? But when looking at the system itself, there are so many elements that also require consideration: time, efficiency, cost. And this isn't just about making more money, but I'll be honest, if you don't make some money, it's hard for a system to continue sustaining. And so hospital systems, even nonprofits, do want to make sure that they're able to pay all the people who are working and keep the lights on. But I think that the true value of efficiency comes in being able to improve surgical throughput. So if you have a surgeon who takes on average half an hour and you can cut down their case time by 15%, you can easily add one more case to the end of the day. And that, I think, is a very practical way in being able to decrease the surgical burden, again, without having to build any more operating rooms. So what is surgery? Obviously, there are different sort of definitions to it, but what I love is this triplet description that came out of Strasbourg back in 2020, and the idea that there is an instrument, there is a verb, some action that needs to happen, and there's a target. And I think that this is a really nice way to sort of break down surgery, because there are many complicated surgeries, there are many sort of domino-like effects in surgery, but ultimately you should be able to pare things down and kind of think of it at its core level. So how do humans optimize surgery? And I think that if you ask different people, you may get some different answers, but this is something that I do think a lot about. And we think about how we, in that moment, kind of try and figure out, as I said, what's happening, what should be happening, could things improve, and more importantly, how could things improve? And in real time, all of these questions need to be sort of answered simultaneously for us to sort this out. So as we think about our logical approach, I want to, of course, acknowledge the work done by Greg Hagers and many others in this idea of the language of surgery, Russ Taylor as well. And so this language of surgery is this great way of us to sort of think about this amazing thing of surgery, but again, being able to break it down into really digestible pieces. Because if we aren't able to sort of sift down to what the core problems are, I think it's very difficult for us to take a methodologic approach. So what I like to tell people who are sort of not surgeons but interested in our work is I like to say that I like to think of surgery as a beautiful story. And in order to execute that story and really have a convincing storyline, you have to be able to present that in a way that you can first break it down into chapters and then break it down into pages, think about the paragraphs, the sentences, the words, and even down to the letter. And that's a great way for us to be able to assess surgery. So if we use cataract surgery as a test case, and I hopefully have made the point that at least it's commonly done, and those of you who have seen cataract surgery will recognize that there's sort of a regular routine or series of steps in order to complete the surgery. We, as a research group, have been looking at sort of components of understanding what's happening in the story. And there are different elements of the story that we first need to be able to accurately understand. What are the instruments being used? Turns out if you can figure out what instruments are being used, you can probably figure out which phase of surgery or which chapter of surgery you're in. But it's one thing to simply say, we can tell what's happening. It's another to say, how well is it happening? And I think that ultimately, when we think about whatever we do as far as output, how is it actually meaningful to the user? So if you give a surgeon a report with like 1s and 5s and ranges in between, it might give them a sense of sort of how they're doing, but it may not equip him or her with the information they need to actually become a better surgeon. So some of the work we did early on involved human annotation, and I thank the students who spent many hours working on this. We actually turned to crowdsourcing to be able to do this, and we were able to get some pretty good results. But as any of you who have spent any time annotating recognize, it is painful. And it's especially painful when you recognize there are technologies like this, and this is an example from SAM, Segment Anything from Meta, that can in a moment beautifully highlight the outlines of all these different items found on a kitchen counter. And this really is such a beautiful figure, because if you as a human were asked to do this, you would want to cry, because it would take so long and it would be so painful, and let's be honest, it probably wouldn't look as beautiful as this image on the right. And to recognize this can all be done in a second is pretty exciting. So it's easy for us, or I should say easy for the smart people in our group to say, how can we pivot and figure out how we can apply such a technology to some of the work that we're doing? So Jay Paranjapi in our group has been looking at using grounded SAM for the cataract surgery data set and being able to do some of this hard work in an easier way and highlight what, for example, is the instrumentation found on the surgical field. So this looks pretty good, probably took a full second, but then we have to recognize there are limits, because sometimes this kind of thing happens too. And though I know you are not eye surgeons, and I spared you any videos for your breakfast enjoyment today, but you'll recognize that, okay, while this purple tool may be highlighted nicely, this gray circle is probably not an accurate representation of an actual human anatomy. And then here you can see, obviously, light reflexes can make a difference. So it doesn't take much for things to necessarily go wrong. And here's another example of where the overlays are just sort of incorrect on many different levels. But I think being able to identify instruments is important, and we've certainly done work to be able to do that. The question then becomes, okay, well, can we then figure out what the chapters are as far as the surgery? And the answer is yes. And so we have been able to basically, without any annotation, chop up these surgical videos to about 90% accuracy and be able to tell sort of what the different phases are. And you can imagine for an individual surgeon, this might be helpful to see, especially as they're learning, where are they spending more time and what steps are sort of more time consuming for them. If you as an educator want to kind of get an idea of how your specific trainee is spending their time compared to other people in the cohort, this is a nice visual way of sort of emphasizing that. And then this video doesn't look like it will play, but I'll spare you that. Basically, it allows, as the instrument moves, to create an overlay and helps highlight the size of the incision that's made. So whenever you ask surgeons sort of what information do you want, the nerdy side of them comes out, and they want as much detail and sort of being able to have a practical enumeration of what are some of the physical properties within the surgery. And then when it comes to asking how well things are going, it's easy for us to, easy now after all the hard work we've done, but easy to be able to say, okay, this surgery is more consistent with someone who's an expert, this surgery is more consistent with someone who's a novice. And if, for example, you are a hospital training system who needs to understand the competency level of the surgeon you're trying to hire, that sort of binary classification is actually pretty helpful. If you are an educator and you want to really dive deeply into the skill set and have an understanding of what that range is, then you want a little bit more nuance to understand who's sort of at the bottom of the pyramid versus at the top, and being able to distinguish the differences and then hopefully help them along. So what we have done is looked at some data within our data set, and in this small data set we have tried to, with I think good accuracy, be able to recognize what are some of the steps, both in supervised and unsupervised methods, look at the skill, the level of skill in 2 key steps within cataract surgery, and then offer feedback, and we're working on improving that because at the end of the day, that's sort of important information. And so you can see that we're developing this technology to really become that accurate and helpful guide on the side. But the truth of the matter is that we don't want to wait. We want things now, and surgical trainees and surgeons looking to improve their skill are no different. And so if you want your question answered now, you probably are not going to wait for another human being to get back to you. And being able to interface with technology that can answer the questions, I think, is helpful. The question becomes then, well, how accurate or how appropriate are the answers that are being provided? And so some of the work that we're doing with Vishal Patel involves developing these video language models and having a video question answer sort of setup so that there can be engaging and meaningful interaction between humans and artificial intelligence to be able to give output that actually is helpful. And one thing that we recognize is that many people learn in different ways. And so sometimes it's by listening, sometimes it's by seeing examples, sometimes it's by reading and being able to put it all together. And obviously, many of us benefit from combinations thereof. So how do we think about how we put this all together? So that's one of the missions that we've had in our group. And as we mentioned, we've been very grateful to have the support of many institutions, including Microsoft, and then work with a design company that we met through the HexSci program here at Hopkins, Standard Beagle, and be able to create this web-based platform that allows for users to basically engage from this currency of their surgical videos and start the human process of annotation with efforts to drive that AI-driven assessment. And so we've created this platform where users can have reports generated, and as we dive deeper into how we can use AI to understand these surgical videos at a greater level, we can then share this information within a very streamlined platform such as this one. And ultimately, obviously, it's nice to have a place to showcase our work, but we want to see that the people who are using these such technologies are actually able to leverage an improvement in their surgical learning curves, which allows then for better patient care. Because certainly, if you think about the surgical training curve and there's this point where people are slowly getting better, if that point involves your mom or your aunt or your uncle, you would prefer that that curve be shorter rather than longer. And so ultimately there is a human cost to learning, and we want to help optimize that. So what are some of the next steps? Well, obviously there are newer and newer technologies that are coming out. Medtronic just announced this recent approval for their Hugo system. So we know that people are working very diligently on new systems, new technologies, and new ways to help improve surgical care. But I would make the argument that we have to figure out how all of this information comes together so that we can really figure out the value of real-time analytics, what are the data points that are actually helpful, how an overlay, for example, for augmented reality may make for better surgeons superhuman because now they have more knowledge available to them, and then figure out how to interface with these newer robotic components that are coming out. Do I think cataract surgery is going to be replaced by a robot? Probably not anytime soon, but I think robotic assisted surgery, even in a successful surgery and in a quick one like cataract surgery, will happen. And so if we were to see the video, this top panel actually has, this is a second instrument held by the instructor, and as the video plays, you can see it sort of wildly point and emphatically sort of direct where the instrument should go. And you can imagine in real time, that can be sometimes stressful when you're like, oh, this one person is really telling me to change what I'm doing. But maybe we can do it in a gentler way by allowing, for example, an overlay showing exactly where the size of this trajectory of instrument movement should be, offering an arrow to actually more gently point exactly how things should move, maybe offering a scale for sort of giving a color scheme of you're working in the wrong direction or you're pushing too hard and not hard enough, and then maybe even offering an audio component to be able to offer, maybe in a more gentle way, audio-driven feedback. So as all of these things come together, I think we're going to see a difference in how surgical care is delivered. And ultimately, I think that the integration of all these technologies is going to happen. I think that some fields are already further advanced, for example, than ophthalmology, but I imagine it's going to be touching all across the surgical domains. And this work represents the efforts of the people who are in this room and online, all thinking about perhaps the same problem, but in a slightly different way, and recognizing that all of our expertise is absolutely necessary. So in the end, do I need to have a sandwich board out on the street and make sure I can drive surgical volume? I think I'm good for now. And I think that having an artificial intelligence guide on the side is a very real thing, and we are seeing it already develop in our present future. And so in the more distant future, I think having an AI sage on the stage is very much going to happen, and we'll see that evolve both in a semi-autonomous and then autonomous way. So again, I must acknowledge the hard work and the intelligent efforts of the colleagues that I'm privileged to work with, and I would like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you. So I'm not sure that we have time for questions. Yeah, we do? Okay, great. So if anyone has a thought, reflection, question, comment. So I'll tell you why I'm eager, because these are my twins who I actually, I was pretty pregnant early on when I met with Swaroop, and so now they're 11, so that's a good testament to how long we've been working on this. And of my boy-girl twins, my daughter actually wants to become an ophthalmologist, so I think that's a testament to how I clearly love what I do. And my son, he said he wanted to be an engineer, but now he wants to be a diplomat, so we'll see where that ends up. But ultimately, I really do believe that medicine is an amazing field, but as we work hard on improving it, it's going to be very, very different for hopefully the career that my daughter has compared to the one that I do.
We have a question online.
Great.
How do you view the feasibility of autonomous systems in non-procedural fields like neurology compared with autonomous surgery? And second, within surgery, would standardized procedures realistically be the first candidates for autonomy, or are the barriers largely the same as in complex operations like trauma?
Great questions. First question, as far as implementation on non-surgical fields, I think that there is a lot of role for technology. So I was chatting with Dr. David Z yesterday, who is now a retired professor of neurology, and his expertise is in dizziness and also eye movements. Eye movements are very, very challenging because you have to sort of understand what's happening. And now we're working on technologies, not we, but we as Hopkins, that will allow patients to take a video and be able to assess what's happening and then sort of track it to a clinical pathway. So I think that as we all have devices in our pockets, they're going to be leveraged to help improve clinical care. And I think that we're going to see a lot of advancement outside of surgical fields, perhaps even faster than within surgical fields. The second question about whether it makes sense to deploy these in sort of well-standardized procedures, I think the answer is yes, as far as development and deployment, because sometimes we need the crazy variables to be sort of at bay so that we can actually focus on developing the technology. Trauma, as you can imagine, all bets are off and anything can happen. And so those are probably the cases where you need more help. But I don't think that those are going to be the test bed cases because there's just too much inherent variability.
Great. Thanks I appreciate the conversation. My name is Danny Kiase. I think we briefly touched base. So I'm a founder of a startup on the West Coast that actually, processes a lot of these videos. So I'm curious, we see a lot, in the academic sphere wanting to do this, but then when it kind of gets more serious and more translational, perhaps, there's a lot of trepidation on the part of surgeons to part ways with their videos. I'm curious from your perspective and speaking with peers, what is the best way to kind of straddle both those worlds so that we can accelerate that progress towards real-world translation.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. So the question of how do we get academicians to maybe let go of their precious data, I think is an important one. And I think it reflects sort of the challenges across the institution, because many times it's not the clinician's choice. The institution and the IRBs and the Data Science Institute and all these different layers of supervision may not permit the free release of that information. So I think that first and foremost is a challenge. But second, I think it also comes into how people feel that their data is going to be used. And so certainly for our platform, looking at video analysis, our intentions are very much in line with our academic institution mission, which is we want to improve teaching, surgical teaching. And so I think that if you can present a use case where the user who's giving the data feels a direct benefit, I think that that really helps. And then the second consideration is, of course, seeing what all the bureaucratic issues are. But I think the other issue, I think, is anytime you give surgeons a chance to say, hey, do you want to share with the world how amazing you are? It does get people pretty excited. So sometimes that ego play can help too.
Kimia, what a great talk. I want to ask kind of a follow-up question along those lines, and maybe I'm going to ask you to wax philosophical a little bit. When we talk about the data, what you're really trying to do is extract the knowledge and skill behind the proceduralist who really created that underlying data. And I'm curious as to your view of who appropriately owns and should dictate how that knowledge and skill is accumulated and disseminated. I think when we look at autonomous driving, for example, there are tons of people who really kind of don't mind contributing to that data set because driving is a very, very widely, practiced skill, and, a lot of people are able to do it. Surgery, historically, has been deeply regulated and normatively controlled, right? It's an apprenticeship, and a large part of how we sort of define the practice of surgery is by controlling who is able to acquire that skill set and that knowledge. So I'm curious, having been in this space and thought deeply about it, what your thoughts are in that arena.
So I think that one of the key pieces to this is recognizing how the data can be tracked. So I think so for example, we consent the residents that we're going to review your videos, they're going to go into this big database, but they won't be trackable to you. And people are fine with it. But we have to be very careful, right? So if we say, in 2022, we had one resident that did exceptionally, let's say good, to just make everyone feel good. So if that's the case, if you're a resident in the class, you may feel like, hey, was that me? Was that not me? I don't want my specific data shared. I think across an institutional level, when things are done more commonly, it's easy to say, hey, surgeon, we're not going to necessarily identify you. It's going into a pool. We're looking at complication rates. We know trainees are involved. But I think it becomes harder when it's more specific surgeries where there are only two people who are doing it. And so I think that the buy-in from the surgeon is really important, but with that comes this trust or understanding of what the data is being used for. I think there's another element that we don't often talk about, which is sort of the monetization of the data. So if people feel like, I love teaching and my teaching pearls are now being translated into these technologies so other people around the world can learn to do surgery the way I teach it, that makes people feel great. But if you have a procedure technique that you feel is yours and that's what you're publishing and you're going around the world being invited to speak about it, you may not be so keen if a robotics company is able to now do that reproducibly. And I think that that's where some of the challenges really come. And it's not that it's good or bad, it's just the reality. As surgeons, we work really hard to build up our skill set. And how much does democratization of that really affect the individual surgeon as well? So no answer, but a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Shameema, thanks for the great talk to kick the symposium off. I love the discussion. I would encourage people to connect with Shameema offline if you're interested, but I'm thinking very excited about the new direction of AI in surgery.